Welcome to God at Work, Stories of Grace and Faith. I'm your host, CharlesGruver, and let me start off by apologizing for being a week late with this episode, but to be honest, last week I wasn't sure if I was wanting to record this episode as planned due to what I found out about the person that I want to talk about. And that's because out of all the people I've talked about so far, this person, his religious beliefs are probably the most unknown or debated. And but through prayer, I pretty much came to the conclusion that regardless of what his religious beliefs actually were, God still used him and his music basically to bring glory to God. And because that is what this podcast is about God, how God has used people, I've decided to go ahead with this episode as planned. So, who was this controversial person that I'm going to look at? Well, it's Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven was baptized on December 17th, 1770, in the Catholic Church. And his exact date of birth is really unknown. That's why I said he was baptized on December 17th, because that's what was recorded was when he was actually baptized. But it is believed that he was born on December 16th of 1770, because as tradition in that time, uh, children were baptized the day after birth, and also due to his family celebrating his birthday on December 16th. He was born to Johann von Beethoven and Maria Magdalena Keverik in Bonn, Germany. And out of actually the 7 children, Beethoven was the second born. Him and 2 of his younger brothers were the only ones to actually survive infancy. His first music teacher was actually his father. He actually came from kind of a musical family where both his father and his grandfather, who also was named Ludwig van Beethoven, were in their time, I guess, known singers. He also had other local teachers, including Giles van den Eden, uh, Tobias Friedrich Pfeiffer, and Franz Rovatini. And the lessons that he received were pretty much harsh and intensive, especially under Pfeiffer, who suffered from insomnia and would often drag Beethoven from bed uh, to the keyboard for late night uh, sessions. Beethoven's father, uh, also knowing of the success that Leopold Mozart had earlier with Wolfgang Mozart and Wolfgang's sister, actually attempted to promote Beethoven as being a child prodigy. And that's pretty much due to his talent being obvious at a young age. In fact, an advertisement or promotion for Beethoven's first public performance, uh, Johann Beethoven actually claimed that Beethoven was 6 when, I believe it was, he was 6 when he was actually 7. Basically, he was being promoted as being a year younger than he actually was. Later, sometime after 1779, Beethoven actually began studies under Christian Gottlob Neef. And it was actually here that Beethoven actually learned about composition, and in 1783 Neef actually helped Beethoven and publish, write his first published composition, which actually was a set of keyboard variations. Beethoven soon also began assisting Neef as the assistant organist at the court chapel, Neef being the court organist. It was also at this time that his first piano sonatas, named Kurfürst, which were published and they were dedicated to the Elector Maximilian Frederick. And around, pretty much right around this time also, Maximilian Frederick's successor, the Elector of Bonn, became Maximilian Francis, who was the youngest son of the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. And as he became Elector of Bonn, he actually brought changes to Bonn as he introduced reforms based pretty much on the Enlightenment philosophy that was going on around that time. This as well as increased support for education and the arts. And it was these reforms and Enlightenment philosophy that basically a teenage Beethoven was pretty much influenced, as well as ideas that were prominent in Freemasonry, as Neef, as well as a number of other adults and people in his life, were actually members of the local chapter of the Order of the Illuminati. And then in December of 1786, Beethoven actually headed to Vienna in hope of studying with Mozart. Details of their relationship, though, and whether they actually met are uncertain, because it was either on his way or almost as soon as he got there, Beethoven learned that his mother was ill, so he returned to Bonn, and then in May of 1787, where shortly after he arrived, she ended up passing away. And at this time, his father slipped further into alcoholism, leaving Beethoven actually to take care of his two younger brothers, thus spending the next 5 years in Bonn. As a result of this, in 1789, Beethoven actually obtained legal order where half of his father's salary was paid to him in support of the family, and he also contributed to this income by playing the viola in the court orchestra. From 1790 to 1792, he composed a number of works, none of which were published. And then, probably on Neef's recommendation, Beethoven received actually his first commission, which was a set of cantatas to mark the occasion of the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Franz Joseph II and the ascension of Leopold II. The two cantatas, however, were never performed, and at the time actually remained lost until the 1880s. It was also around this time Beethoven was first introduced to Joseph Haydn. And as Haydn stopped in Bonn while traveling to London in around Christmas of 1790, and then a year and a half later, they actually met up again when Haydn was returning to Vienna from London, and it was here then that arrangements were possibly made for Beethoven to actually study under him. Then in November of 1792, Beethoven left Bonn for Vienna and learned shortly after his arrival in Vienna that his father had passed away. At this time, also Mozart had also recently died, to which Count Waldstein wrote to Beethoven, though through uninterrupted diligence, you'll receive Mozart's spirit through Haydn's hands. This basically resulted in Beethoven feeling that he was actually basically becoming a successor to Mozart, and wrote works that actually had a Mozartian flavor. And while Beethoven didn't immediately set himself out to establish himself as a composer, he devoted himself to the study of performance, and by 1793 he had actually established a reputation as an improviser in the salons of nobility, and also established a reputation in Vienna as a piano virtuoso. While his friend Nikolaus Simrock actually began publishing Beethoven's compositions, though he did withhold some works so that their publication in 1795 would actually have a greater impact. And I think that was probably because a lot of them, that's when he first performed them, was around that time. Beethoven dated his hearing loss pretty much, because if there's probably two things people know about Beethoven, it was he wrote, I believe it's the Fifth Symphony that everyone knows of, the dun 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 dun. But then also, he was deaf. And he dated his hearing loss to pretty much a fit he suffered in 1798, where at the interruption of his work, he went into a rage, and having fallen over, found himself actually deaf. I guess he recovered some of his hearing after that, but it was only partially recovered, and then from there it started gradually declining, as well as him having severe tinnitus, which is that ringing in your ears. His deafness also brought about thoughts of suicide, which were recorded in his Heiligenstadt Testament, which was kind of some letters or correspondence to his brothers, but it also recorded his resolution to continue living for and through his art. And his hearing loss didn't really prevent him from composing music, but it did stop him from performing in public. And actually, for the last months of his life, Beethoven was actually bedridden, and on March 26, 1827, he died at the age of 56. And that's kind of just some highlights of Beethoven's life that to kind of cover it, but there is so much more to his life that I haven't included, but I do have linked to in the show notes. But now, kind of to the part more about his religious beliefs and everything. And as I mentioned earlier, Beethoven was influenced by the Age of Enlightenment, and also some will state that the Ode to Joy, which is found in his Ninth Symphony, as an optimistic hymn championing the brotherhood of humanity. In fact, I believe his Ninth Symphony is one of his works that people will attribute to being more of a deistic work than an actual Christian or religious work. One source I found uh, stated that Beethoven was known not to attend mass regularly, and pretty much from that, it's inferred that he was not an Orthodox Christian. And while his religious beliefs were not clearly defined, references in his letters to others imply that he did have a firm belief in an ultimate, benign, intelligent power, which pretty much defines the whole deistic movement of they have a belief in God, but and that God has created the world and everything, but it was more that God created the world and then set it spinning and has no more interaction with the world whatsoever. Um, he also showed a genuine interest in what he considered to be true church music, which was defined by the styles of the earliest composers of religious music, as well as he became fascinated with the texts of the Mass, which it said possibly drawing less conventional interpretations from the text in order to pretty much represent a Mass of his own composition. Another source that I found talking about Beethoven's religious life focuses on or talked about how Beethoven in his personal writings also did express a belief in a personal God, at least at some point in his life. Also, one of his favorite books was a book by a Lutheran pastor. But like some of his correspondences, especially in regards to his deafness, talks about how he, I guess to an extent, how he understands suffering to an extent. Let me pull up the quote, or not the quote, but what it actually said. It basically emphasized his nearness and his understanding of suffering in language that often recalls the Psalms, and he often refers to Christ as a suffering fellow man, if not as Son of God. He also frequently wrote religious inscriptions and titles on his compositions, such as Grateful Thanks to the Almighty After the Storm, Holy Song of Thanksgiving, of a Convalescent to the Deity. Another thing was when he became guardian of his nephew, he actually made sure that his nephew regularly went to the sacraments, even though Beethoven himself didn't. It was also they also mentioned though how in midlife Beethoven actually did develop an interest in like Hinduism and the Eastern religions, often quoting uh, them at times as well. Though the quotations often emphasize the transcendence and pure essence of God, and were stated not far from the doctrines of the Old Testament. Also, in regards to whether or not he was Christian, again, some of his compositions have pretty much a leaning towards the express deistic religiosity of the Age of Enlightenment, while other works of his actually belong firmly within the Orthodox Christian and Catholic tradition. So it's kind of, he wrote, his compositions were written just about for both. I mean, the one source talks about how, while he did have choral pieces and stuff, such as the Ninth Symphony, that suggested a deistic religiosity, as well as, when you look at it, some of his inscriptions, like Holy Song of Thanksgiving of a Convalescent to the Deity, kind of almost have a more deistic feel to it. He did write, again, works that belong in the Christian and Catholic tradition. Christ on the Mount of Olives, which was a passion piece that, instead of focusing on the crucifixion, it took an unusual look and actually concentrates on Christ's agony in the garden. He had the Mass in C major, which was a work of reassurance and hope. He did have a commissioned oratorio, The Triumph of the Cross, that unfortunately did not come to fruition, although he did keep promising it for years. The one source talks about these says that Christ on the Mount of Olives and Mass in C major, neither of them are widely performed today, which is a pity, since they are both fine works that document Beethoven's continuing quest for a distinctive sacred style, which they then go on to talk about how this quest was actually fulfilled in 1824 with the Missa Solemnis, or the Solemn Mass, which was written to celebrate the installation of, as Archbishop, Beethoven's patron and close friend, Archduke Rudolph of Austria. So, kind of with the question of, and there's actually some debate on the religiosity or the Christian leanings of the Solemn Mass as well, which I'll, again, have all these sources I referenced and looked at linked to in the notes. But with the question of whether Beethoven was actually a Christian or a deist, really in the context of this podcast, as I mentioned before, I kind of came to the conclusion that regardless of what Beethoven's actual religious stance was, God still used him to produce a number of works that in some way or another have been used to bring glory to God, which, again, is what the God at Work podcast is really about. It's about how God has worked in and through the lives of people. So, again, this is CharlesGruver, that's Ludwig van Beethoven, and that's God at Work.